Get the full global macro and markets picture with Capital Economics' all-access packages. CE Essential gives you full access to all of our award-winning written analysis, all of our online briefings, and a host of critical data tools. And for deeper engagement with our Economist team, our proprietary data, and seamless integration of that data into your workflow, CE Advance is our most complete solution. Go to capitaleconomics.com today to learn more about CE Essential and CE Advance.
This is a special episode of the Weekly Briefing from Capital Economics. I'm David Wilder, and we are recording this on the 16th of July. We're talking about the fracturing of the global economy. To discuss it, I'm joined by Group Chief Economist Neil Shearing and by Chief Asia Economist Mark Williams. Hi, guys.
Hey, David. Hey, David.
I don't usually do this on the podcast, but I do think it's useful to introduce the two of you because since way back in the first Trump administration, you've been leading the work at Capital Economics on this issue of global fracturing. And in many respects, it's a conversation that starts with China. And Mark, you've been a sort of pioneer. You've been looking at how these long-standing bilateral tensions have sort of boiled over into decoupling that soon spilled worldwide and has basically fractured the post-Cold War global economic system. I know you've got fresh analysis on fracturing that you're going to be presenting to clients across North America, Europe, and Asia after the summer. And Neil, you're Group Chief Economist. You direct the analysis of our 60-plus team of economists worldwide. You've been sitting on top of this fracturing issue from a global macro markets perspective. And you've got a book coming out on August 28th, and it's called The Fractured Age, a sort of culmination of all the work that Capital Economics has been doing on this issue. That's the first plug for your book. There may be more to come. But let's start with the idea of fracturing, because it is becoming more and more common currency in discourse around the outlook for where the global system is going. Not often clear what it involves, lots of different ideas. Mark, just give us a brief introduction, would you, to the original idea of what we understand as fracturing?
Yeah, thanks, David. I think that, going back, like lots of the best ideas, this was triggered by a sense that someone was wrong on the internet. And we wanted to put out a view that was, I think at the time, a bit counter to the general consensus. The general consensus being back in sort of 2017, 2018, that Donald Trump, at that point, at the start of the first trade war with China, was something of a sort of an aberration, that the globalized world order, that was the kind of natural state of things, that Trump had come in, he had some very different views, and in some ways they didn't make a lot of sense. You're talking about tariffs, and textbooks said that they didn't make any sense, and that things would revert back to how they were, that Trump was one of a kind, and this couldn't really outlast it. And our sense, which was different, which was what we wanted to get out there, was that actually what, in our view, the breakdown in the relationship between the US and China wasn't really driven by Donald Trump at all. It was driven by something much deeper. In particular, that globalization was not this kind of natural state of affairs in the global economy. It was a particular project that had been pursued in the 1990s and the 2000s, and that it always had a political aspect. I think a lot of people saw it as just about economics, just about this is the way to boost incomes, to boost efficiency. And so, of course, everybody is going to settle into a globalized world. It just makes sense. But of course, if you go back to the 1990s, in those early post-Cold War years, it was always quite clearly a political project by the West to try to mold the rest of the global economy in the shape of the West and try to push political liberalization alongside economic liberalization. And by the early 2010s, it was beginning to be clear that certainly with regards to China wasn't working, that in fact, China was becoming more autocratic under Xi Jinping. It wasn't liberalizing at all. And so we were in a world in which you had this emerging economy growing very rapidly, which was converging in terms of kind of the size of the economy with the US, and quite plausibly at that point could overtake the US economically, but was not converging politically, was not going to be a liberal democracy. And our view was that essentially that was the source of the friction between the US and China, because that was not sustainable. And it wasn't really about Donald Trump at all. So we started to think about, well, how does this play out? What happens when Trump leaves office? Because that was perhaps the big difference at the time that we had, which our view was that we're not going back to how things were. Actually, things are just going to roll forward. And of course, in retrospect, that's exactly what happened. That Joe Biden did not roll back the tariffs on China, and actually he put on more controls on tech controls and these kinds of things. And so it's actually all just gone in one kind of direction over the intervening years.
I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but I do want to come on specifically to Xi Jinping and his role in this. But before I do, Neil, Mark talks about understanding that globalization isn't the natural state of things. On that basis, then, what follows in a fractured world, in this fractured age that you talk about?
Yes, indeed. I think that's the starting point for us, is to think about the kind of history, the economic history of all of this. And as Mark says, it's partly economic, it's partly political. And there was, of course, a view cutting through the 1990s and 2000s that globalization was this immutable force. You could try and push back against it if you like, but you couldn't prevent it. There is a quote from Kofi Annan saying, arguing against globalization is like arguing against gravity. This idea that it's just inevitable. Well, that to us sat uneasily against kind of the experience of history. We've had these waves of globalization before in the late 19th century and early 20th century that then, of course, gave way to a period between the wars where countries turned inwards. And then we had a period of integration after the Second World War that hit the buffers in the 1970s. So it never seemed to us inevitable that globalization, once it started getting going again in the 1990s and 2000s, would therefore be inevitable. There was a natural state of affairs, but nor did it seem likely that all of the gains from globalization would be lost. I mean, when we started to look at the data, those arguing that Trump's tariffs in the first term, for example, would usher in a period of 1930s style beggar thy neighbor protectionism, it just wasn't evident in the data. We had these continued year-on-year increases in global trade volumes, such that by the time we got to 2023, global trade on some measures was at a record high. So it wasn't a period of deglobalization, but nor was it the case that globalization was inevitable. And it was clear that, not necessarily starting with Trump, but starting with after the global financial crisis and with Xi in 2012, something had changed in the political underpinnings and the architecture around globalization. So what is that? And then, as Mark says, it's US-China rivalry and the idea that was bring these two economic superpowers into conflict, and that crucially other countries would ultimately be forced to pick a side. And that's the crucial thing, I think, is the extent to which other countries are going to get pulled into this. Because it would be easy, I think, to say, this is just a US-China thing. Yeah, they're the world's two global superpowers. But most other countries would try to straddle this divide. And what's more, they would do so successfully. But then when you look at what's happened since, actually, it's become increasingly clear that in many areas, countries are being forced to choose a side. If you look at the tech controls that the US has placed on China, that's required the cooperation of many countries in Europe, in Taiwan, in Korea, in Japan. If you look at the restrictions that China's put on rare earth exports, for example, to the US, in some cases that's required the cooperation of other countries too. So increasingly, there's this sense that the geopolitics is back as a driver of policy decisions and economic outcomes. And that's really what fracturing is about. Now, we can get into what the economic consequences of all of this will be, but in our view, it's going to be determined by three things. The first is the extent of the break between the blocs. How deep and how wide does the schism become? The second is how other countries align, either behind the US and China on the one hand, or China on the other hand, and the extent to which the US and China forces other countries to pick a side. And then the third is, worst case scenario, the extent to which these two blocs are on a collision course that inevitably brings them into some form of, from Cold War to hot war and conflict. But that gives you a framework for starting to think through the impact on supply chains, on global capital flows, and ultimately the impact on the global economy.
Mark, as I said at the top, you have got this new analysis coming out talking about the extent to which this story's changed in the wake of Trump's return. And you and Neil have just spoken about it very much as a sort of process, but particularly if you subscribe to this sort of great man theory of history, there have been key actors that have influenced this narrative. You mentioned Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. talk a bit about what's prompted this idea to go back to the original work, to look at how that narrative has changed, and give us a sense of perhaps how you think this process might be changing under the second Trump administration.
During the Biden administration, I think our job was in some ways relatively straightforward because it's fairly clear what the Biden administration was trying to achieve. They were trying to build a group of allies that would put pressure on China, and they were using lots of kind of carrots to encourage other countries to put tech sanctions on China and so on. It was everything kind of lined up, all the policies lined up. It's quite easy to see what the purpose of these policies were. Now, it's much more chaotic under Trump. Where, yes, China is clearly being hit quite hard, again, with tech controls, with tariffs as well. But so are many of the traditional US allies. And so we've been trying to think through the different scenarios for how this could play out. There's the view that we've put out and we've largely stuck to, that the world is coalescing into these two US and China-centered blocs. But there are other scenarios worth considering as well. Over the past few months, people have talked about this reverse Nixon strategy, the idea of Trump managing to prize Russia away from China. There are some people talking about the world being more divided around great powers, are going back maybe to a more 19th century kind of model. So you have spheres of influence with the US dominating the Western Hemisphere and Greenland, and Russia, the former Soviet bloc, and so on. So under Trump, there are a wider range of outcomes that I think need to be considered. We shouldn't lose sight, though, of the fact that for all of the chaos and uncertainty, it does still seem to be the case, and I guess this is one of the points that drops out from our work, that China is still the main target. Allies are getting pressured as well, but in many cases they're being pressured to put pressure themselves on China. We're seeing with the trade deals that have been announced that pretty much everybody has been asked to exclude China in some way, either from supply chains or to make sure that there's no rerouting of goods from China through third countries. So China is still sort of on a pedestal as being treated differently from anyone else. The tech controls that the Biden administration put on China, they're being revised. Some parts of them have been rolled back a bit, but they're still there. China is still being singled out. And while it is certainly the case that the US is acting more aggressively or assertively, however you want to put it, towards traditional allies, it's, in many cases, this coercion is angled at squeezing China as well. There's been success in getting European governments to spend more on defense, for example, but that appears to be, at least in part, driven by a desire to free the US up to reorient its focus, its defense military focus towards East Asia, for example. There's a lot more possible outcomes, I think, under Trump. And we want to think through the different ways in which they could affect how the global economy looks in a few years' time.
Neil, I just want to pick up on what Mark was saying there about these potential outcomes, because we have this core view that fracturing at its heart are these competing US-Chinese-led blocs, as you both described. Along comes Trump. He threatens to annex Greenland, to pull troops out of Europe, possibly parts of Asia too. He's slapping tariffs on everyone. How seriously is the risk that the US bloc itself doesn't hold, that Trump's unilateralism basically shatters it? And what would be left if that happens?
Well, I think it's pretty serious, to be honest. And I think one of the greatest risks in all of this for the US is that it's starting from a position of strength. When you take a step back and think about the countries that naturally ally with the US, most of Europe, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, large parts of Asia, somewhat counterintuitively, most people would say that part of the BRICS, India, would align with China, but actually long-running border dispute there. India is perhaps one of the countries that would benefit from a more fractured world because it could absorb some of the manufacturing that's shifting out of China as a result. So you get India, Mexico, Canada, Australia. You quite quickly get to about 2/3 of the world's GDP that would naturally tend to align with the US. More than half the world's trade takes place within that bloc. About 80-90% of global capital flows take place within that bloc. So the US is starting from an enormous position of strength. And the greatest danger in all of this is that it pushes its allies away such that it can no longer rely on their support for things like tech controls if it's trying to contain China, for example. Or it becomes more difficult for US firms to move the production of strategically important goods out of China and towards and into another low-cost country, and therefore retain some of the benefits of globalization. So, as Mark says, there's a number of different ways this could play out, but I think the biggest risk for the US is that it ends up pushing its allies away, and in doing so, undermines one of its core advantages in a fractured world. Now, will that happen? Impossible to say, but I think it is worth noting that the depth and strength of ties between certainly the US and Europe run pretty deep. The strength of transatlantic ties run pretty deep. Trade ties, financial ties, political ties, social ties, cultural ties, historical ties. It might take more than one person to break those, important though that one person is. I think also we would push back a little against the idea that other countries might emerge or other regions might emerge as a third bloc in this fractured world around which other liberal democracies might coalesce. So one idea during the rounds is that if Trump pushes away Europe, well, other liberal democracies might coalesce around a European bloc. But if you think about it and what that might entail, I mean, is Europe really going to have a different payment system to that of the US? Difficult to imagine. Are global firms going to start to reorientate their supply chains, but based around these kind of three blocks on the basis of kind of the actions of one president that might be gone in 3 years' time? Probably not. And as I say, the depth and strength of those ties across the Atlantic are pretty deep. Not to mention the fact that Europe tends not to speak with one voice on these issues, and it tends to be buffeted by the forces of fracturing rather than leading them and driving them. So pretty skeptical that Europe might emerge as the third bloc in all of this. But certainly a big risk for the US is that it starts from this position of strength, but ends up severing ties with its allies, pushing them away, thereby undermining one of the key strengths it has at the starting point of fracturing.
I think that one way to think about this is kind of what fundamentally is the source of this divide. Is it simply economies competing with each other or different kind of powers competing with each other? If it is, then if the Europeans can get their act together, maybe they can decide to compete as a bloc against the US and against China. But I don't really think that is. I think that the fundamental kind of split really here is one of values of autocracy against democracy. And if that is correct, then it's clear where the Europeans and the Japanese sort of sit on that side of the divide. There isn't a third side to sit on. It's quite striking with the US strikes on Iran, for example, that NATO members pretty much all lined up behind the US and supported those strikes, because that is the divide. It's a democracy autocracy divide. And certainly if you do look at the opinion polling in many countries on whether they would prefer there to be a unipolar, bipolar or multipolar world, pretty much everybody says that a multipolar world. But when it comes down to it, if the divide is between your kind of autocracies on one side and your democracy on the other, then the people in the democracies, and actually a lot of people in the less democratic countries, would prefer to be on the democratic side of that divide. So if it really is about values, about autocracy, then to my mind, that's always going to lead to one kind of Western, if you want to use that word, pole in the global economy, which is centered on the US.
I think it's really striking too when you look at how that plays out in practice. As Mark says, there's kind of geopolitical implications to this, and we saw some of this in terms of support for the strikes on Iran, but also we see it in economic policy too. If you look at the response to Trump's tariffs, I thought it was really striking that Europe essentially said, up with this, we will not put. We're going to have to push back against this. We will retaliate, and then did essentially nothing. And the same is true of other countries in East Asia too that would historically align with the US. Whereas China did push back forcefully, and we ended up in that position in late April where both sides were putting tariffs on each other of well over 100%. So it's all very well Europe saying, people suggesting that Europe might emerge as this kind of third pole around which other liberal democracies might coalesce in the face of Trump. But the experience so far is that by and large, Europe would still continue to bend to America's will under Trump.
And it's probably also worth pointing out, isn't it, that we're talking about this very much through the lens of macroeconomics. That's what we do. But in terms of looking at China as a competitor, that was a conversation that was going on in the Pentagon, in the Department of Defense, in the very, very earliest years of this century, on this understanding that all of the investment, the modernization of China's economy, of the PLA, would ultimately lead to this emergence of a strategic rival to the US. So that was certainly the prism through which the Defense Department was looking at things, even if others in the US establishment were looking at more in terms of engaging China with the hope that in doing so, it would foster these stronger ties.
We're also, I think there's a danger also of thinking about this from just through the Western prism, but I think it's also quite striking if you look at China's actions. So there was that story a couple of weeks ago that China's diplomats were telling the EU that China does not want to see Russia lose in Ukraine. It's quite an undiplomatic thing to be saying, but it's worth thinking about why is China backing Russia? Russia does not matter that much to China economically. It buys commodities from Russia. It could buy them from elsewhere. But it is, I think, pretty clear that it matters to it geopolitically as a big ally on that kind of autocratic side of the divide. That we shouldn't just think this is the West, the democratic parts of the world trying to squeeze out the autocracies. The autocracies themselves are also trying to bolster their grouping in the global economy. And they, certainly Beijing has been very conscious of the fact that the integration of China into the global economy that was facilitated by entry into the WTO and so on was seen by the West as a means to pursue political liberalization. And right from the very beginning was trying to make sure that didn't happen. And clearly they've succeeded because China is a more autocratic place now than it was in 2001. So the agency in all of this isn't just in Washington. The agency just as much is in Beijing.
Neil, let me ask you, it's increasingly framed, isn't it, globally at least, as a war for what used to be called the commanding heights. This idea that an emergent China has this long-standing master plan to dominate key 21st century industries, the cutting edge of tech. At the heart of this framework of fracturing is this idea of these flows of capital and investment and people and technology and ideas, indeed, being reshaped by the core tensions between the US and China. So talk a bit about the global macro implications of fracturing in terms of technology.
Yes, technology, I think, is going to be a key fault line in the fractured world. And AI in particular is where we're seeing that play out at the moment, particularly the development of large language models in China as a rival to LLMs developed in the US. Now, where does all of this go? Yet again, the US is starting, I think, from a position of strength. Again, reflecting the fact that a lot of the foundational technologies that are required to develop new technology are being produced in either the US or in US-aligned countries. If you think 90% of the world's advanced semiconductors currently produced in Taiwan, there are lithography machines that are used to produce those semiconductors coming either from the Netherlands or Japan. But China is catching up incredibly quickly in a lot of these areas. So if you look at different measures of technological progress in China, so, for example, if you look at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's Critical Technology Tracker, that suggests that China now leads the US in 37 out of 44 critical technologies. So the US, I think, still holds an advantage because of its stranglehold over some of these foundational technologies and because of the breadth of its alliances and the technological prowess within those. But China is making gains. Now, this is playing out in different ways in different areas, but in green technology in particular, if you think about battery technology, for example, China, I think, now has a lead over the US. Critical question from the US side is, how does it respond to this? And to what extent will it pursue technology controls to try and cut off some of those foundational technologies and hamper China's catch-up? An issue from China's side is that although it is now starting to compete with and indeed outcompete the US at parts of the technological frontier, this is not translating into productivity growth more generally in the Chinese economy. Indeed, the way China's been able to achieve this is through vast amounts of industrial subsidy and an active industrial policy strategy that in many ways has embedded structural problems within China's economy that manifested themselves in much weaker productivity growth. So industrial subsidies helping to catch up with the technological frontier, but also sustaining zombie companies that are loss-making, need to be allowed to fail, but can't be for social and political reasons. So critical issue for the US is the extent to which it can focus its efforts on restricting China's access to critical foundational technologies. The issue for China is the extent to which it's able to not just catch up at the technological frontier, but then use that catch up to generate productivity growth within the wider Chinese economy.
Mark, I wanted to ask you, I mean, you and Neil have basically answered the question, but I want to ask you direct because there is speculation about a Xi Jinping, Donald Trump meeting sometime this year. Marco Rubio recently talking about the possibility. Talk of a grand bargain has quietened down quite a lot since the whole tariffs thing really kicked off. But presumably any announcement of a summit would kickstart all of that speculation again. So how unrealistic is it to think that these two leaders couldn't meet and couldn't hammer out some kind of live and let live deal?
So some kind of deal, sure, it is possible. But a grand bargain, I guess it very much depends on what you would count as a grand bargain. To my mind, that signals a sort of a rollback of what we've seen, the tariffs, the tech controls and so on over the past 10 years. So some sort of deal in which China got free access to US technology, tariffs were back to more normal levels, US was guaranteed access to rare earths and so on. For that to happen, you need the US to be comfortable with the idea, I think, that China, autocracy, huge state involvement in the economy and in the exchange rate and so on. So the US comfortable with that kind of economy is challenging the US for global economic supremacy. And I just don't see that is a plausible scenario. The US will try to hold China back, I think. In the other direction, China's leadership, I think, is also not going to trust the US either. As we've said, this distrust of the US predates Trump, goes back to that whole push for globalization by the West being a political project, goes back to the alarm in Beijing over the color revolutions of the mid-2010s. So I just can't see either side becoming friends, really. Now, that doesn't preclude there being some kind of deal. Obviously, in the first Trump administration, we had the phase one deal in which China agreed to buy loads of soybeans and Boeing jets and so on. And yeah, that Trump likes deals. There's probably something that could be done along those lines of phase two deal, but we shouldn't expect it to be very grand, whatever it is. And actually, what we've seen in these Geneva and London talks over the past few weeks really underlines that point, because when Trump initially put these huge tariffs on China, that was billed as a way to force China to make meaningful changes in the way that it manages its exchange rate, in structural reforms in the economy, opening up the economy, all this sort of thing. All of that has been entirely shelved. They haven't had any discussions, as far as I can tell, about that stuff at all. The Geneva and the London talks were simply about trying to roll back some of the tariffs and the rare earth restrictions back to where they were in April. So they've set their sights really low in the talks over the past few weeks. And if there is to be any deal, it will be a pretty small bargain, would be my guess.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Neil. That's Mark Williams and Neil Shearing on global economic fracturing. As I said at the top, we are holding in-person briefings on the state of global fracturing since Trump's return in September and October. The first is in Singapore on September 3rd. Then the team are in Hong Kong on September 4th. They're in London on September 17th. And finally, on October 9th, they'll be holding a briefing in New York. I will link to each of those events in the podcast notes. I'll also link to our fracturing homepage, which collects all of our key analysis and data on this topic. That fresh analysis about fracturing in Trump's second term will be out in September. Look out for details of that. And before that, on August 28th, Neil's book, The Fractured Age, How the Return of Geopolitics Will Splinter the Global Economy, is being published, so look out for that as well. As you heard Neil and Mark describe it, fracturing is perhaps the dominant macroeconomic theme of our age because it cuts across so many other global issues, from near-term noise around trade and tariffs to the emergence of AI to climate change and the green transition. If you're wondering what this all means specifically for your business, then do get in touch and we can set up a meeting with our Economist team. And remember that CE Essential and CE Advanced, our all-access packages, give you all of our written analysis on fracturing, as well as data tools, online and in-person event invites, ways to engage directly with the Economist team, and much, much more. Again, get in touch and we can set you up. The weekly briefing will be back on Friday, the 1st of August, to review the July ECB and Fed decisions and preview the Bank of England's upcoming meeting. That day is also the deadline for Trump's most recent tariff threats. Will he fold again, or is he really, really serious this time? Watch this space. Until then, goodbye.